has seen things ratchet up even further. An underground explosion at the weekend in North Korea, which they claim to be a hydrogen bomb. That's unconfirmed, but what is certain is that it was a nuclear explosion on a pretty huge scale. I think everybody, all the experts agree that in terms of power, it was very much bigger in terms of kilotons than that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in August 1945. And clearly, many in America have completely run out of patience, including the US ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, who says it's clear to her that Kim Jong-un is begging for war. She said enough is enough. War is never something the United States wants. We don't want it now, but our country's patience is not unlimited. And this huge explosion taking place just 7 days after the rocket that was fired and went over the northern island of Japan called Hokkaido. So things are happening. Trump himself, well, he was asked coming out of church whether he would attack North Korea. He said, "We'll see." What I thought was particularly interesting was not what Trump said in response to this, but perhaps what the Defense Secretary General Mattis, known as Mad Dog Mattis, said. And he was really very, very strong in what he said. He warned North Korea that any threat to the US or its allies, and he was explicit that that meant Japan, South Korea, etc., would be met with a massive military response. So, what do we do now? The Americans have made it clear that it is so far and no further. One option, clearly, is a military strike. But there is another option that is interesting and something that Trump himself talked about. Already, the United Nations have put sanctions on Pyongyang and on the North Korean administration. But what's really interesting is that that Korea's Trade Investment Promotion Agency makes it clear that 80 countries traded with Pyongyang in 2016, including India, Pakistan, China, Russia, Singapore, Germany, Portugal, France, and a list as long as your arm. And here's the really interesting bit. Through a series of tweets, because it's always through tweets, isn't it, with the president, Trump has said the US was considering cutting economic ties with all countries that do business with Pyongyang. Now, clearly, that is something that the Chinese are really very worried about, and they've responded somewhat negatively. Most of North Korea's exports do go to China. So let's be clear about that. There's a fair bit of business goes on with Russia as well. So put yourself, imagine that you are the 45th President of the United States of America. You are in Donald Trump's shoes. What do you do next? Would you order a strike, a military preemptive strike, in which case call me on 0345 6060 973. Perhaps you think that Trump is right on trade and that sanctions need to be pushed even further, to the point perhaps of threatening China, that they can't go on sending, tens of thousands of containers every week to the American mainland. If that's your view, please text me on 84850. Or perhaps you think actually America's gone far enough. It's got to be left to the peninsula, got to be left to the region to sort this out. Well, if that's the case, using the hashtag Farage and LBC, tweet at LBC. And of course, you can watch me live on Facebook because we're here in London. And already, as we pre-tweeted this question, Caroline Lucas, the joint leader of the Green Party, has said a preemptive strike on North Korea would be an unmitigated disaster. Six-party talks need to be urgently restarted. Diplomacy the only way. And that indeed is the position of the British government, who in response to everything that happened at the weekend and General Mattis's comments have said they want a diplomatic solution. But we're not talking about the British government. I'm asking you, imagine that you're there in the White House. You could even be worth $7 billion for all I know. But you're there in the White House and you see this huge escalation that you genuinely think poses a threat to world peace and to the future. What do? Is it the military route? And at what point do you trigger the military route? Because I thought what was really interesting was the way that Mattis said any threat to the US or its allies. So he's not even saying it would need to be a missile that hit Guam or hit South Korea or hit Japan. He's saying any threat. He's left it pretty open. Is it military? Is it economic? Is it diplomatic? Or, as Trump said last week, has the time for talking passed? What would you do? I wonder what Hope in Elstree would do. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Hope, you're the 45th President of the USA, facing this very deeply worrying situation, perhaps not quite yet the Cuban Missile Crisis of the early 60s, but getting in that direction. What do you do?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I actually study at the University of Nottingham Contemporary Chinese Studies. So at the beginning, I would think, you know, if I was Trump, well, let's take an aggressive approach. However, let's be pragmatic here. You've got the whole West that, you know, the economy could just go overnight. That's not ideal. It's better to leave it to China and Russia, the two superpowers in the area. China has a peaceful rise. Sure, it matters in their area. So I think it's best to leave it to them to sort it out with. And believe me, if something happened, I think China would be the first one to intervene and sort them out.
Well, on the trade issue, Hope, that I mentioned earlier, China has criticised Trump for threatening to stop trade with countries doing business. And indeed, their foreign ministry spokesman, Geng Shuang, told reporters in Beijing that China regarded as unacceptable a situation in which, on the one hand, we work to resolve this issue peacefully, but on the other hand, our own interests are subject to sanctions and jeopardised. This is neither objective nor fair. So China already kicking up pretty rough at the American suggestion that they could potentially stop all trade with China because of their involvement with North Korea. And the question, Hope, I want to throw back to you is, you know, I do understand the argument, let the players in the region sort it out. But do you think China would actually do anything?
I think it would, because, to be honest, South Korea is a bit of like a mosquito bite on China.
Yeah.
You know, it's there, it's a nuisance. Eventually, if they keep on bugging them, they'll do something and squash it down.
What, South Korea or North Korea, Hope? I'm misunderstanding you.
No, I'm in North Korea.
Okay, sorry, right, fine, okay, good. Well, you know, that may be right. I have to say, I'm unconvinced that left to their own devices, China would do very much at all. That's just my feeling on it. But Hope, thank you for your point, and Hope there from Elstree, making it clear that actually the Americans should bug out, let China, let the regional players sort the whole thing out. Richard on Facebook says, many options are on the table apparently, but I can't think of a good one. Gillian says, China must do more to stop this silly little man. And Philip says, I'd say the Americans should stop being hypocrites. Only one nation has dropped nukes on people. Yeah, Philip, it was actually quite a long time ago. And I think after their experience in Okinawa, they realised they were up against a fanatical force who believed in a deified leader. And I think General MacArthur believed that invading the Japanese islands themselves, the mainland, would perhaps have cost 1 million American casualties, and that is why they dropped those 2 nuclear bombs. Was it right? Was it wrong? Different debate perhaps to the one we're having this evening. Blake says, send in an elite force to eliminate the leaders of North Korea. Well, I'm sure quite a few people think that. But you know what? It took us years to find bin Laden in a house in Pakistan. I'm not sure it's really all that easy. I wonder what Ajit in Brighton thinks of this. Ajit, good evening.
Hi, Nigel. How are you doing?
Well, I'm okay, but, you know, increasingly getting worried as every week goes by. This crisis escalates and gets worse, doesn't it?
It does. I just want to say thanks very much for giving me the opportunity to let you know my thoughts on this.
Not a bit.
I wanted to make a very simple statement, which is that my feeling is that diplomacy is now past. However, a preemptive strike is not what would be most beneficial to the world at the moment, and trade negotiation is really what we're looking at.
Okay, so, you know, Trump and others and the UN Security Council have been all sorts of resolutions passed on sanctions, but what Trump suggested this weekend that America could stop trading with anybody that's doing business with North Korea. Is that perhaps a solution?
Well, I want to sort of break it down to a more, as they say, the devil is in the detail, into the fact that what North Korea is actually sitting on is untapped underground resources, metals and minerals, etc. So we're talking about a specific trade embargo that begins to cut off the lifeblood of the funding that's allowing their military to be strong, but not to take away their ability to protect themselves. And I think we need to look at them as if we were looking at ourselves.
So you mean strategically? You mean strategic trade sanctions, yeah?
That's it.
Okay.
I mean, at the moment, I think it's zinc, gold, and copper that they have a huge resource from. And I would imagine that the other countries in the region are looking at a long-term way of getting hold of those resources.
Okay. Ajit, thank you for your point. Ajit from Brighton saying we need to be selective and clever and crack down and stop them making money out of things that effectively allow them to buy and pay for weapons. A very large nuclear explosion in North Korea over the weekend, said to be a hydrogen bomb, has got the Americans talking in even stronger terms. Trump perhaps threatening to cut off trade with all countries that engage with North Korea, which of course would include China and Russia and many, many others. And General Mattis, the big military chief, their defence spokesman, making it clear that if anybody poses a threat to the US or its allies, they could be met by a massive military response. And I'm asking you, what would you do if you were President Trump? Would you launch military action? Would you go for deeper sanctions? Would you perhaps say, we've said enough, and hope others in the region can sort it out? I mean, Lee thinks that on Facebook. He says, let China sort it. Don't forget there are 2 billion of them. Not sure it's that many, but there's a lot of them, Lee. Richard says, send a drone. Kill Kim Jong-un. Repatriate North and South Korea. Simple as. Simple, Richard said. Dead simple. Send somebody in, knock out the top guy. It'll all be wonderful. Michael says, do you not think that KJU is just trying to defend his country from a strike from another country? No, Michael, I don't. I think KJU is trying to make North Korea a serious nuclear power, and he's not doing it for defence. He's doing it and flexing his muscles and saying to the world, look at me. And my worry, Michael, is that he's not rational. And I really sort of think back. There was this chap back in the 1930s who was the Chancellor in Germany, and he kept flexing his muscles, and he kept showing the world that he could defy the international rules. He could break the Versailles Treaty. And we kept saying, now stop it, don't be naughty. You know, so far and no further. And when it came to the Sudetenland in 1936 and his military move into there, that was the moment at which I think the West should have got together, gone in and stopped him. And if we'd done it, we might just have saved tens of millions of lives. And that is why I, as somebody who is normally very concerned about the use of military force and believe it should only be done in extremis as a last resort, is why I do actually understand the language that I'm hearing from America. I wonder what Adrian in Barnet makes of this conundrum. Adrian, good evening.
Evening, Nigel.
So you're So you are the president, Adrian, of the USA. What next?
There's no easy solution, no simple solution, no nice solution. The Chinese are not going to do anything. They haven't done anything for a long time. Yeah. The bottom line is, in my opinion, the Americans will not tolerate a hydrogen bomb on an ICBM. They'll not tolerate it, and they will have to do something. Military action, if they're forced into it. I believe that this North Korean fella, Kim, whatever his name is, he's
Kim Jong-un.
The Americans in. Yeah, Kim Jong-un. He's forcing them into some kind of action, and I think the Americans are going to have to do something. Blockade the ports, maybe, some kind of preemptive strike. At the end of the day, There's no good solution. But
No.
a worse solution for the Americans is allowing him to have a hydrogen bomb on an ICBM. That's simply unacceptable.
Just for those, Adrian, listening who don't quite get the lingo,
Yeah.
Intercontinental ballistic missile, and certainly the North Koreans have got the capability of firing those. With what accuracy, etc., we don't know the answers to any of that. So, do you think the North Koreans are close to the point of being able to deliver a hydrogen bomb through an ICBM?
Don't know.
No,
In
nor do
a
I.
sense, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because you can't just sit back and let them develop and refine their systems. At some point, they will have that capability, unless someone stops them.
So is Mattis right? Are Mattis and Trump right when they say...
I think they are.
So far and no further, and if you push the line, we will act.
I'm afraid so, yes. I don't support Trump. I wouldn't have voted for him, but on this particular matter, I think he's absolutely right.
Adrian from Barnet, thank you. This hysterically extreme language on both sides needs to calm down now. China are the only ones who can sort this, says Chris by text. Well, I wonder what Rob in Stepney Green thinks. Rob, what would you do?
Well, if I was President Trump, I would completely change everything. I mean, America needs to step down as their role as world police. I mean, they haven't exactly got the best track record of sorting things out in the past few decades.
I agree with that. I agree with that, Rob. I agree with that, Rob. And what's interesting, Rob, of course, is that in many ways Trump was elected saying that America should interfere and get involved in military conflicts far less than it had done under the Clintons, the Bushes and the Obamas. But I think, Rob, and, I do know the guy a little bit, I think that he genuinely views the North Korean regime as rogue, as out of control, and posing a genuine threat to world peace.
But wasn't it the same with the Soviet Union? It was a communist country that had nuclear weapons, and that wasn't sorted out by preemptive strikes. It was sorted out by dialogue, wasn't it?
Well, it was sorted out by dialogue. It was sorted out by money and technology too, wasn't it? You're thinking back to sort of the Reagan era. I mean, look, Rob, I'm not saying to you that I think a preemptive strike should be launched, but I am saying that I think the Americans are right about this, and somebody has got to stand up to this guy that I frankly think is a pretty irrational madman.
Well, but the thing is that the fact that he has nuclear weapons, that gives North Korea respect. You see, if North Korea didn't have nuclear weapons all these years, they would have been invaded a long time ago. And the good thing about nuclear weapons, as dangerous as they are, is that they prevent countries from invading one another. So while we're constantly on the brink of world destruction, we're also preventing a lot of wars from coming into existence. And that's why we haven't really had a full-on total war since the Second World War. It's only been big countries picking on little countries ever since then.
Yeah, Rob, I mean, I understand that. And, of course, that is where rational people don't want to get blown to smithereens. I ask you, Rob, do you think, in the case of this North Korean regime, that we're dealing with rational people?
Well, it's hard to tell. I mean, and because we're not dealing with rational people at the same time, if we were to try to figure out some military measure, there's obviously a big chance that it could backfire. So surely that would put us at more risk.
Well, that may be true. Rob, listen, there are no easy answers to this. Rob from Stepney Green, thank you. Mohammed in Oxshott, you are the American president, Mohammed. What next?
Well, goodness forbid I'm ever the American president. Please, Nigel, call me many things, but not that. So I guess for starters, to answer your question, Nigel, I would rule out military action, at least as of now, and I'll explain in a minute why. What would I do, though? I would deepen economic and non-military measures, and I think the U.S. have already kicked off a set of targeted sanctions, but I would deepen those. I'm not sure I'd go so far as to break ranks with allies and with economic allies in particular in the region. I think all that risks is isolating potential support even further, and I'd like to just mention something where that's concerned in a second. The other thing I'd also do, or I'd also encourage, would be deeper diplomacy. I think a few callers back, someone said that the time for diplomacy has passed. Well, I'm afraid I'm not aware of any earnest measures of diplomacy taken by the U.S. in the last 3 months, and I never thought I'd agree with political heavyweights like the Green Party, but hey, I do on this one. I think this one calls for diplomacy, and I'm afraid the caller before talking about the nuclear deterrent, well, you know, with respect, I've got news for the gentleman. The deterrent argument only works when everyone's playing by the same rules. And right now the rules have been shot to bits with continued detonations and missiles being flown over countries like Japan, etc. So I must say, though, I've said diplomacy, but I've also seen and believed that the U.S. and Mr. Trump in particular has proved himself incapable of that by calling potential supporters like China currency manipulators, by threatening to cut trade ties with China, by taking, pressure and frustration out on South Korea. And I believe in response, they've indicated that they believe the recent criticism of the last 24, 48 hours to be unwarranted.
Yes.
I don't think that's the way you go about building support.
No, you're quite right, Mohammed, and this is a point that I haven't made, that Trump was pretty critical of South Korea. He said they were too busy appeasing North Korea, a point they didn't like one little bit. No, Mohammed, we're not dealing with a normal situation here at all. As you say, missiles flying over a northern Japanese island. It is a pretty scary situation. You think more diplomacy, but how does diplomacy work? I mean, what does Trump do, Mohammed? Does he say to Kim, come to Trump Tower for lunch and let's talk about this? What does he do?
Well, if he's got KJU at Trump Tower, there's another string to the Mueller investigation. Let's not go there, Nigel. But certainly what I would advocate for starters is something quite simple. I mean, I'm not aware of the U.S. having asked a very straight, simple question, and that is, what is North Korea after? And from what I gather, when you strip all the layers and veneers away, they're really after one thing, and I'm not going to reduce it to this. This is simply my understanding of what's been said, and that is they're looking for unification of the Korean Peninsula.
They are, which is something we've spent 60 years trying to stop. Mohammed from Oxshott, I thank you very much indeed for your points. In response to the explosion of a purported hydrogen bomb over the weekend by North Korea, America are getting tough, and it's not just Trump, it's their ambassador, Nikki Haley, to the United Nations, and it's also Defense Secretary General Mattis. They're saying any threat to America or its allies will be met with a massive military response. And I'm asking you, put yourself in the position of the US President. What would you do in this increasingly worrying situation? But for those who are fans of Mogmentum, Mogmania, Jacob, who appeared on this show a few weeks ago, Parliament is back, and Jacob has come back from Somerset, where you may have noticed he's been doing a variety of interviews in his garden over the course of the last few weeks. He's back, and the Times this morning was speculating that he may well be offered a position of some kind, a position so that the Prime Minister could test his suitability for higher office. And he has said, in response to this, Jacob, that he would only accept a position like that if he was allowed to speak out freely on Britain's relationship with Brexit and the European Union. And he appeared on the Ian Dale show before me today, and you can get that interview by going to lbc.co.uk. He said, I just don't think it's going to happen. Well, I don't know. But according to the bookmakers, he is now second favourite to be the next Tory leaders. So, Mog fans, go to the LBC website, see his interview with Ian Dale. Meanwhile, we are back to this thorny issue of what the US President should do next. And Des from Stoke says, sanctions, sanctions, and more sanctions. Soon, no one will be trading with anybody. Stop. Think, then talk. Trump should sign them up to a trade deal. Hi, Nigel. Why is no one talking about targeted assassination? No, Chris, they are. Lots and lots and lots of people are, actually. Further sanctions will force North Korea to get around the table. China must force this. However, if another missile is launched, it should be considered as an act of war, says Malcolm. I'm told, Nigel, your callers are naive it's not in China's interests to solve the North Korean problem, a point actually that many people have made. And indeed, a point that came up on my new LBC show that takes place on Sunday mornings between 10 and 12, the first of which was yesterday. And China really in a pretty ambiguous position here, that it's difficult to see. I mean, a lot of callers and texters say, look, let's leave this to China to sort out. I'm not convinced that China actually would sort this out. George says to me on Twitter, Nigel, you're such a hypocrite. You lot branded Hillary a warmonger, but your mates about to nuke North Korea. Well, it's a fair point, George, and one of the reasons I did support Trump is I did think that Britain and America together had got involved in too many long-running military campaigns. George, you know, we've been in Afghanistan for 16 years, and still the generals are arguing, if we all send some more troops, it's just going to be great. I'm not convinced that it is. But there is something different about this. This is not about regime change because we don't like people, because there is some sort of supposed link between what's going on there and the safety of our streets, something that was never proved. This is about, frankly, a madman who is posing a threat to world peace. And that I think is the difference. But I wonder what Joe in New Cross thinks. Joe, good evening.
Oh, good evening, Nigel. How are you? I'm a first-time caller.
Well, welcome, Joe, and we welcome first-time callers, and that's great. So this issue, you feel so strongly about, you picked up the phone, yeah?
I did, I'm afraid.
Don't be afraid at all.
No, first of all, I mean, you know, I don't envy Donald Trump at all.
But Joe, for the purposes of this call, you are Donald Trump. You are the US president, so what are you going to do?
Well, my wife certainly thinks so when she's got the credit cards. But anyway, what I was going to say is what I was going to say.
It's a very serious subject, this, Joe.
Yes, I know. Sorry. Back to the nuclear war. What I was going to say is I think reluctantly there has to be some kind of intervention militarily, and the reasons is that, first of all, I think we've all seen that, you know, sanctions are effectively, you know, at their most extreme, starving a country into submission. We've already seen that he's prepared to do that to his own people as it is.
Oh, yes.
And secondly, you know, I think that we are missing the point. It's not just a case of whether he's prepared to fire a missile at what. I don't think I've heard anybody mention yet that actually the other risk to us, to the UK, the Europe, the US, that those nuclear weapons that he's creating could very easily find their way into the hands of other organizations. You know, he could hand nuclear weapons over to ISIS or other terrorist groups.
No, it's a very good point.
Also, you know, not every threat has to come from within his borders. If the wrong person has these weapons, but you know, I'm a little sad that Barack Obama has not called this show, because if you asked him what he would do, well, of course, the answer is nothing, isn't it? You know, I genuinely think that Donald Trump has been landed. He's been landed a very, very poor set of cards, I'm afraid, and I don't think he can win whatever he does, to be completely honest with you.
He could, Joe, have simply ignored all of this. He could have pretended it wasn't happening and got on with his America First agenda. But what I know, Joe, for a fact, you know, knowing him and people in his regime, is from early on they were deeply concerned that North Korea was posing a threat, not just to America, but posing a threat to world peace. And he's doing this because he thinks morally it is the right thing to do. That's why he's doing it. But, Joe, you raised an interesting point, and it's one that doesn't seem to get debated, and it's this. It's not as if North Korea is this wonderful, happy country where, you know, all the citizens think their leader's wonderful and life is fantastic. I mean, there's a guy called Rembo Facebooks me and says many citizens in the north would probably love to live in freedom in the south of Korea. All the defectors show that. And, Joe, you made the point about the fact he's prepared to starve his own people. Is there a possibility, Joe, and you're someone that obviously thinks about this, that if Trump was able to get rid of Kim, whether that's through a military strike or an assassination squad or whatever it is, could he ultimately be seen to be the liberator of millions of people in North Korea who could then have the chance to live in a democratic state?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously that would be the dream. The problem is I think that if you were just to snipe him off from a distance, as it were, Nigel, I'm afraid I'm not very good at military terms, but if snipe him off from a distance, as it were, I just worry that would just create another famous UK-US power vacuum, and lead to perhaps, an even worse or equally bad regime.
Well, it may well. It may well. I was just musing, Joe, that the sort of 35 to 40 million people living in North Korea, and maybe getting rid of this regime, maybe will just give them something of a better life. And that would be a great thing, wouldn't it? Joe, I thank you, first-time caller, for your thoughts on all of this. And I go next to Kevin in Weybridge. Kevin, have the Americans gone too far already?
Yes, far too far, I think. I think the biggest problem we've got is the military-industrial complex.
Do you know, this is something, Kevin, that you know about, and I think many, many listeners won't. This was identified in the 1950s, wasn't it, by President Eisenhower?
Yeah, Eisenhower.
Yeah.
And again by JFK, wanting to smash the CIA to smithereens, I think were his words.
Yeah.
It's like they're like the biggest bully walking around the playground with the biggest stick, and every now and then one of the little guys wants to stand up for himself. So I think North Korea are just, it's a lot of saber rattling. You get it with China, you get it with Russia. America's got about just under 800 bases, military bases around the world. They've got submarines plotted all around the China Sea. So China's sitting there thinking, well, what? And the same with Russia as well. What would America do if Russia put a load of military bases along the Canadian border or the Mexican? They wouldn't be happy. Or if China was running military operations just off of America, America wouldn't be happy.
No.
But we're all brainwashed as much as North Korea's brainwashed. Obviously, North Korea is a rogue state and it's terribly governed. But we've got to get a rein in on America. America makes too much money from war, and they will always want to be in a perpetual war or some...
Kevin, I do understand those arguments about the military-industrial complex. Of course I do. But aside from that, do you yourself think that this North Korean regime poses a threat to world peace?
I think they're just trying to say to the world, you can't just bully us. I don't think they want to. They know what would be the benefit of them dropping a bomb. It would be shot out of the sky before it gets anywhere, and they're...
So why are they flexing their muscles? Why are they firing missiles over Japanese airspace? Why are they, exploding underground nuclear hydrogen bombs and boasting about it? Why are they doing it, Kevin?
Because America's got several submarines sat off their coast. They're running military operations.
I don't buy that, Kevin. I'm sorry. I don't buy that. However big America may be militarily, however threatened some people may be by them, I don't think, Kevin, that explains all of Kim's behaviour. Kevin from Weybridge, I thank you for your view. I'm asking you, imagine that you are the 45th President of the US, and you are Donald Trump. What do you do about this growing threat from Kim, Mad Kim, as some view him, from North Korea? And I've got a whole mass of texts and tweets and Facebook messages and callers, and so far, every single caller that's been on this show tonight is a first-time caller to LBC, and that includes John from Reading, who's my next caller. John, good evening.
Good evening to you, Nigel. I've got the answer.
You've got the answer? Wow.
I've got the answer, Mr. Trump.
I'm looking forward to this. Go on, fire. It's all yours.
We've been told that in South Korea, the anti-missile capability is being put there by Mr. Trump.
Yep.
And it's also been put in Japan. And if the North Koreans fire an ICBM, which is the only platform that really threatens the state, why don't they take it out while it's on its way to Japan? It would seem it's not an act of war, and it would demonstrate they really do have the capability to prevent an attack by North Korea on the States or on Japan.
Because, John, defensive shields, however amazing they may be at shooting down ICBMs or fighter planes or whatever it may be, only one has to get through that shield for it to be a disaster.
Well, that's true, but if they've got monitoring stations in South Korea, and the Americans have got an awful lot more missiles than North Korea, I guess, is it not worth a go? If they miss, they don't have to say anything. If they hit it, that's a big statement.
Well, yes, it may well be, John, but I'm not absolutely convinced that you've got the answer. It may be. I mean, do you think North Korea poses a threat to world peace?
Well, we had some South Koreans over relatively recently,
yeah.
and I asked them if this was the biggest issue, really, in their lives, and they said no. The corruption scandal in politics in South Korea was the biggest.
Yes, which would be the recent thing, yeah.
Thing of interest to them. And so far as North Korea was concerned, they thought that the North Korean people had relatives, families, friends. They are of the same sort of background, really, as everybody in North Korea. They really wouldn't want to. There wouldn't be much of a stomach for attacking militarily South Korea. That's probably changed a little bit. But I still think that, you know, that there's scope for shooting a missile down if the States really can do that reliably.
Well,
I accept your argument about numbers.
Yeah, my worry is it only needs one to get through. John from Reading, thank you. Richard on Facebook, just to cheer us all up, says, it's not just nukes that should worry us. He is developing the delivery system via the ICBMs that could, for example, have anthrax. A lot cheaper to make and harder to detect until used. Graham says the US has a base in Japan, Guam and South Korea. As in the Cold War, they surround and bankrupt the country they don't like. Well, yes, many people, Graham, do see America as aggressors. America would argue that, or Trump would argue, they're fighting, you know, for something that is right and for world peace. And I made a comment about Trump earlier that I expected a response to, and I've got it. Absolutely absurd, Nigel, that Trump is doing this on moral grounds. He doesn't have a moral bone in his body. How about he's just protecting America's interests? Anthony Thompson sends me on Twitter. Well, I'm not absolutely convinced by that, Anthony, and I think he's perhaps a rather better chap than you do. I wonder what Jordan, who is in Battersea, makes of this. Jordan, good evening.
Hello, Nigel. How are you?
Well, I'm okay, but I mean, you know, how are you? You are the President, Jordan, of the United States of America. What do you do next?
Well, there's not much you can do because, unfortunately, the great powers, the United States included, and Russia and others, over the last 20, 30 years, let's say in the post-Cold War period, have set a very dangerous precedent. So if you are a rogue nation or any country, but especially these rogue countries, as they call them, and you want to survive, you want to stay put, just as you know, staying in power, then you need to have a nuclear weapon. So if you look at the last 20 years, look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Ukraine, Crimea. If you don't have a nuclear weapon, regardless of treaties, in the case of Ukraine, they had the Budapest Agreement, I think it was called.
Yeah.
In the case of Iraq, originally, you know, they didn't. In the end, they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it goes on.